Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, to a sound you couldn't explain? A whisper, a creak, a breath that didn't belong to you? Tonight, I'll be your voice in the darkness, as we explore 10 true stories from people who heard something. Turn off the lights. Put on your headphones. And let's listen to what hides in the silence, when you're all alone. Story 1, The Voice in My Grandmother's Room. When my grandmother passed away, I volunteered to stay in her house for a few weeks to keep it maintained while the family handled paperwork and probate. Her home was a quiet little place in upstate New York, modest, old-fashioned, and tucked away on a peaceful, tree-lined road. I'd always felt safe there as a kid. The plan was simple: I'd stay alone, work remotely during the day, and keep the lights on at night. It was early spring, the air was still crisp, and the fireplace helped cut through the cold. I stayed in the guest room, right across the hall from her bedroom, the one she passed away in just 2 weeks prior. The first few nights were uneventful, even comforting in a nostalgic way. The creaks of the floorboards and hums of the old house felt like familiar lullabies. But that didn't last. On the fourth night, I was drifting off to sleep when I thought I heard a sound faint, like someone clearing their throat. I sat up, ears pricked. It had come from my grandmother's room. I told myself it was the old pipes, or maybe the wind sneaking through the cracked window panes. Still, I got up, tiptoed across the hall, and peeked into the darkened room. Nothing. But just as I turned to go back, I heard it again, this time clearer. A soft voice. A woman's. "Is someone there?" I froze. I could feel the blood drain from my face. The voice was gentle, but not familiar. It sounded uncertain. Not angry. Not malicious. Still. I didn't answer. I closed the door and went back to bed, wide-eyed and gripping my phone like a lifeline. The next night, it happened again. Same time, around 1:30 a.m. This time, I was awake when I heard it. The voice was clearer. "Why is it so cold?" I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of it. The voice didn't sound threatening, but it also didn't sound human anymore. There was something off, like it was slightly behind a wall, muffled, and echoing inside the room. I recorded the audio on my phone. I didn't know what else to do. The next morning, I played it back. There it was, the rustle of sheets, the sound of the house groaning, and a whisper. "Are you still here?" My stomach flipped. I hadn't answered. But something or someone had asked. That afternoon, I locked her bedroom door. That night, I heard the doorknob rattle. On the 7th night, the air in the house felt heavy, like it was thick with fog, even though it was perfectly clear outside. I went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the voice. Who or what was I hearing? Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a loud bang. It had come from across the hall. I sat up, staring at the now open door to my grandmother's room. I knew I had locked it. I had double-checked. Then I heard footsteps. Soft. Bare. Walking inside the room. And then, slowly, from the dark beyond the door. "It's so dark in here, can you light the lamp?" I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I crept toward the room, hand trembling, barely able to breathe. Inside was empty. But the closet door was cracked open. And on the nightstand was the old lamp I remembered from childhood. It was on. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't plugged it in. It was glowing softly, even though I had removed the bulb on the second day I arrived. I had done it because I thought the wiring was faulty. There was no bulb. Just light. I ran. I left the house that night and drove straight to my sister's, 3 towns over. I didn't sleep. I didn't even close my eyes. 2 weeks later, I returned in the daylight with my uncle to pack up a few more of my grandmother's things. We were sorting through old books when I found her journal tucked beneath the floorboard near her bed. In one entry from last winter, she wrote, "There's someone in the room with me at night. A young woman. I hear her voice when I'm half asleep. She sounds lonely. I don't think she's trying to scare me, but she doesn't know she's not alive. I never stayed there again. But sometimes, when I wake in the middle of the night, no matter where I am, I swear I still hear it. A whisper. A question. Can you hear me now? What would you do if that happened to you? Tell us in the comments below." Story 2, The Knocking Beneath the Floor. It started when I moved into a tiny studio apartment on the edge of Portland, Oregon. I had just gotten out of a bad breakup and wanted something quiet, something small where I could focus on rebuilding my life. The place wasn't much, just a main room, a kitchenette, and a small bathroom, but the rent was cheap, and it backed up to a patch of woods. I was told that the building had been a family home once, split into several studio units over the years. Mine was in the basement level. Cool in the summer. Quiet. Too quiet. I didn't mind at first. In fact, I welcomed it. For the first time in months, I could sleep without someone arguing next to me. I could hear the wind in the trees, the occasional owl at night. But that peace didn't last long. Because something was under the floor. The first night it happened, I was up late reading. Around 1 a.m., I heard what sounded like a soft knock 3 times in the corner of the room near my bed. Knock. 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 I sat up, confused. It wasn't the pipes. It wasn't the fridge. It was too deliberate. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was the neighbors above me. The next night, it happened again. Same time. Same spot. This time, the knocking was faster, almost urgent. Knock, 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 knock. I knocked back, half joking. Nothing. But about a minute later, it knocked again. Only once. Right beneath where I was sitting. I asked the landlord if there was anything under the floor: plumbing, old vents, maybe even raccoons. He just laughed and said, "That apartment's always been a little weird. Don't worry, the floor's solid." But the knocks continued. Every night. Always around the same time. Then came the voices. It was subtle at first. Like someone muttering just below hearing range, right beneath my bed. I pressed my ear to the floor one night and thought I heard it more clearly. Can anyone hear me? I jerked back. I didn't sleep that night. The following evening, I laid out my phone on the floor and hit record. The next morning, I played it back. And what I heard chilled me to the bone. Not just a voice but many. Help me. Still down here. Don't go upstairs. I had been alone the entire night. I called my friend Max, who's into ghost hunting and weird tech. He brought over a microphone rig and a basic EMF reader. I felt ridiculous, but I was also scared out of my mind. That night, we sat in silence, waiting. At exactly 1:04 a.m., the knocking started. It was louder. Faster. Like someone banging desperately from beneath the concrete. Then the EMF meter spiked. Max went pale. Then, clear as day, we both heard it. We're still here. It didn't sound like it was coming from under the floor anymore. It was in the room. The air went icy cold. I could see my breath. Every hair on my body stood up. Then came the most terrifying part. From beneath the floor, we heard scratching as if nails were clawing up from underneath. Max grabbed his gear and bolted. I followed. We slept in his truck that night. The next day, Max did some digging and found out something chilling. Before the building was turned into apartments, it had been owned by a man who went missing in the 80s. Not just him, his wife and their 2 kids vanished without a trace. Police suspected foul play, but no bodies were ever found. The man's name? Eli Whitman. The same name etched faintly into the inside of a floorboard I had pried up the next morning, in the corner of my room. I moved out 2 days later. Sometimes I still dream of that knocking. And sometimes I wake up at 1:04 a.m. and hear it again. Even in my new place. Even when I'm not alone. If that gave you chills, hit the like button and let us know your thoughts. Story 3, The Footsteps in the Hallway. I've always been someone who enjoys their solitude. It's not that I don't like being around people, but there's something peaceful about the quiet moments spent alone in my apartment, especially at night. After a long, stressful day, my sanctuary is my room. It's small, tucked away at the end of a quiet hallway in a building that's seen better days. The creaky floorboards and drafty windows add to its charm, or at least, That's what I used to tell myself. I moved into this apartment a few years ago. It wasn't the best place, but it was affordable. The rent was cheap because the building was old, and it didn't have much in the way of amenities. The neighbors were nice enough, though a bit distant. The building itself felt like it had seen generations come and go. There was an old charm to it, but also an undeniable sense of history. I always had the feeling that something, or someone, was just waiting to reveal itself. For the first year, nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. I'd hear the usual nighttime sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the wind rattling the windows, and the occasional car driving by outside. But all of that changed one night, and I'll never forget the first time I heard the footsteps. It was a Friday night, a week into the winter months. The apartment was colder than usual, even with the heating cranked up. I had just finished a late dinner and was getting ready to wind down for bed. It was already past midnight, and the only light in the apartment was the soft glow of my bedside lamp. The room was quiet, just the way I liked it. As I laid down in bed, I heard a faint creak from somewhere in the hallway. At first, I thought it was the wind pushing against the building. But then, there was another creak. And another. A slow, deliberate sound, like someone walking across the hallway. I could feel my heart start to race, but I brushed it off as my imagination. Maybe it was just the house settling. That's what I told myself as I pulled the covers tighter around me, trying to calm my nerves. But the sounds continued. Soft footsteps, slow and steady, moving down the hallway outside my room. I sat up in bed, listening intently. The sound wasn't loud, but it was there, unmistakable. I thought I heard the footsteps pause just outside my door, then resume, walking past my room and down the hall toward the stairs. I told myself it was just the pipes or maybe a neighbor out late. There was nothing to be afraid of. But as I lay back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The following nights were worse. The footsteps continued, always at night. Always when I was in bed, trying to sleep. They came at the same time around 1:30 a.m. and always sounded like they were coming from just outside my room. Sometimes, I would hear them walking up and down the hallway, pacing back and forth as if the person couldn't decide where to go. Other times, the footsteps would stop directly outside my door, followed by a long silence. I would lie there in the dark, heart pounding, waiting for the next sound. One night, I decided to try something. I set up a camera in the hallway facing my door. I was determined to catch whatever was causing these noises, to prove that I wasn't imagining things. I didn't sleep much that night, waiting for the inevitable sound of footsteps. And sure enough, around 1:30 a.m., I heard them again. I got up quickly, checked the camera feed, and was stunned to see nothing. There was no one in the hallway. The camera had captured only the dark, Empty corridor. Confused and frustrated, I checked the door to make sure it was locked. It was. I tried to reassure myself once again that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know what. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. The footsteps had become unbearable, and I was at my wit's end. I decided to confront whatever was out there. I waited, tense and alert, for the familiar sound of those slow, deliberate steps. When they came, I sprang from my bed, grabbed my phone, and ran into the hallway, determined to catch a glimpse of whoever or whatever was making the noise. I reached the hallway just in time to see the last of the footsteps disappearing into the shadows. My breath quickened as I rushed to the end of the hallway, peering around corners and trying to see any sign of life. But there was nothing. The hallway was empty, just like it had been every other night. No one was there. Yet, the footsteps had been real. I could still hear the faint echo of them in my ears. I walked down the hallway to the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I noticed something that I hadn't seen before, a door, slightly ajar, at the end of the hall. It wasn't a door that I had ever paid much attention to. It was an old storage room that hadn't been used in years, according to the landlord. But now, as I stood there staring at it, I could see something. There, just inside the door, was a shadow. A figure. I stepped forward cautiously, my pulse racing. As I reached for the door, it creaked open by itself, revealing the dark, empty room. But it wasn't empty. There, in the far corner, was an old rocking chair, moving slightly back and forth. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The chair was empty, yet the sound of the slow creaking filled the room. I backed away slowly, fear gripping me tightly. As I turned to leave, I heard something. It was soft at first, but then it became clearer. A whisper. A voice. "Go home," it said, in a voice that wasn't mine. I ran back to my room, heart hammering, and locked the door behind me. The whispers didn't stop, nor did the footsteps. For the rest of the night, I could hear them, faint but persistent, echoing down the hallway. The next morning, I left the apartment and never returned. I moved out that weekend, unable to shake the feeling that something had been waiting for me in that hallway. That something still lingers there, hidden in the shadows. The landlord told me that the building had once been a boarding house. Many of the tenants had passed away over the years, some under mysterious circumstances. But I never asked for details. There are some things you don't want to know. Now, I live somewhere else, far from that old building. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps. Soft and steady. Always in the distance. And no matter where I go, I'll never forget the whispers. Ever experienced something similar? Share your story down below. Story 4, The Voices in the Walls. I never thought much of it when I first moved into the small studio apartment on the 3rd floor. It was old, yes, but it had character. The exposed brick walls and the view of the city skyline from the window made it feel cozy. I was starting a new chapter in my life, freshly out of college and settling into my first real job in the city. I had lived in my own space before, but this was different. I was alone, and I wasn't sure what to expect. The apartment was inexpensive, and for a single person, it was more than enough. I loved the privacy, the quiet nights, and the sense of independence that came with living alone. I didn't know much about the building's history, except that it was located in a part of town that had seen better days. But I told myself it didn't matter. The apartment was affordable, and that was what I needed. I settled in quickly, arranging my things, decorating the space, and making it feel like my own. The first few weeks were uneventful. I would come home from work, eat dinner, and then spend the evening reading or watching TV. It was a peaceful routine until the first night I heard the voices. It was a Saturday evening, and I had just finished watching a late movie when I decided to go to bed. The city sounds filtered through the window, but it was otherwise quiet. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. As I lay in bed, about to drift off to sleep, I heard it. At first, it was faint. A soft murmur. It was coming from the walls. I paused, straining to hear, but the noise stopped as soon as I focused on it. I thought maybe it was the pipes, old and creaky as they were, or perhaps the building settling. But then it happened again. This time, I could hear what sounded like whispering. It was muffled, but unmistakable. It wasn't just one voice, but several, overlapping each other. It was as if a group of people were talking, but I couldn't make out any words. I sat up in bed, my heart racing slightly. I could hear the voices clearer now, like they were coming from just behind the walls. Confused, I got up and walked around the apartment, checking the windows and doors to make sure everything was locked. I even knocked on the wall a few times, half expecting someone else in the building to be making noise. But there was nothing, just the faint, persistent murmur coming from within the walls. It wasn't until later that I realized that the sound seemed to be moving, following me. The voices didn't stop. If anything, they grew more frequent. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just the building's age showing its quirks. But every night, as soon as the lights went out, the whispers would begin again. Sometimes they sounded like muffled conversations. Other times, they were louder, almost as if someone was standing right outside my door. I started recording the sounds on my phone, hoping to capture something clear enough to make sense of. But every time I listened back, the voices were indistinct. I couldn't make out a single word. They were just there. Constant. Unsettling. It wasn't just the voices, though. There were other sounds that didn't belong. I started hearing what sounded like footsteps, pacing back and forth behind the walls. The pace was uneven, like someone was walking with uncertainty, stopping, and then starting again. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the footsteps, my heart thudding in my chest. I tried talking to my neighbors, but they didn't hear anything. They said they hadn't noticed anything unusual. But the longer I stayed in that apartment, the more I felt like something was off. I began to dread the silence that came with nightfall. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, echoing with voices that didn't belong to anyone I knew. One night, I decided that I had had enough. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The voices were louder than usual, almost as if they were right next to my bed. I could hear them distinctly, a mixture of hushed tones and urgent murmurs. I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable. Something wasn't right. I grabbed my phone and recorded the sounds again. I placed it next to the wall and hit record, but this time, I decided to go further. I had to know what was going on. Slowly, I stood up from the bed and walked toward the wall where the sounds seemed to be coming from. I ran my fingers along the cool surface, my breath shallow with anticipation. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but what happened next made my blood run cold. I heard a faint scratching noise from within the wall, like fingernails against drywall. It was subtle at first, but then it grew louder, more frantic. It was like something was trying to get through the wall. My heart raced as I took a step back, but the scratching continued. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the whole wall seemed to tremble. I jumped back, startled. The noise stopped abruptly, and for a moment, everything was eerily quiet. I stood there in the dark, my mind racing. What was that? Had someone been trapped inside the wall? I walked cautiously back to the wall, running my hand along it again, my fingers trembling. There was nothing. No sign of a hole or anything unusual. But the air felt thick, heavy with the silence that followed. The next day, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the apartment. I called the landlord, explaining what I had heard. He was sympathetic but didn't have any answers. The building, he said, had been around for decades. There was nothing structurally wrong with it, as far as he knew. I decided to stay with a friend for the night, just to get away from the oppressive feeling that had settled over the apartment. I returned the following afternoon, hoping that a day away would bring some clarity. But as I opened the door to my apartment, I was hit with the same suffocating silence. There were no voices, no footsteps. For the first time in weeks, it was quiet. But as I walked deeper into the apartment, I noticed something on the floor near the wall, a small, old key. It was rusty, the kind of key that you would find in a dusty drawer of a long-forgotten cabinet. I picked it up, feeling a sense of dread wash over me. I didn't know where it came from or why it was there, but something about it felt wrong. I couldn't help but wonder if it was connected to whatever had been hiding within the walls. Perhaps there was more to the building's history than I had realized. I kept the key, but I never heard the voices again. That was over a year ago. I moved out of the apartment soon after, unable to shake the feeling that something was waiting in the walls. And yet, every time I look at that key, I'm reminded of the whispers, the footsteps, and the unnerving presence that I couldn't escape. Wherever I go, the feeling never leaves. The voices might have stopped, but I can still hear them in my mind. I still hear the faint whispers, as if they are just waiting to be heard again. Was it just a dream, or something more? Comment what you think happened. Story 5, The Whispering Shadows. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. I had been working long hours, barely sleeping, and I was exhausted. I needed a break, so I decided to rent a small cabin in the woods for a couple of nights, far away from the noise and stress of the city. I'd always loved nature, and I thought this would be the perfect way to reset. The cabin was isolated, perched on the edge of a forest that stretched for miles. No neighbors for miles, just the sounds of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush. When I arrived, the air was crisp, and the smell of pine filled my lungs. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The cabin itself was rustic, a little run down, but charming in its own way. It was equipped with all the basic necessities, a small kitchen, a cozy living room with a fireplace, and a bedroom with a big window overlooking the forest. At first, I was content to simply relax. I spent the day hiking, reading by the fire, and unwinding. But as the night fell, something shifted in the atmosphere. The peace I had once felt began to feel unnerving. The woods outside grew darker, and the silence inside the cabin seemed to grow thicker, heavier. By the time I was ready to go to bed, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly. I had just gotten into bed, the fire still crackling softly in the background, when I heard it. A faint whisper. It wasn't loud, just a barely audible murmur, like someone was speaking just outside the room. At first, I thought it was the wind. The windows were open, and the night breeze was rustling the leaves outside. But no. This sound was different. It wasn't the wind, it was a voice. I lay still, listening, trying to make sense of what I had heard. But the whisper didn't come again. I shrugged it off as my imagination running wild. After all, I was alone in a cabin in the woods, far away from civilization. It's not unusual to feel a little unsettled in such a remote place, especially when the sounds of nature are so different from what I was used to. But then, as I started to drift off to sleep, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. I could swear the voice was coming from within the room, just beyond the edge of the bed. It was soft, like a whisper just out of reach, but there was something unnervingly familiar about it. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was strange, almost soothing, yet unsettling at the same time. I sat up, heart racing. The room was dark, and nothing seemed out of place. There was no one there. I got up and checked the windows and doors, making sure they were all locked. I felt foolish for being so paranoid, but something about that whisper, that disembodied voice, sent a chill down my spine. The next night, the whispers returned. But this time, they were louder, clearer. It was as though someone was standing right next to me, whispering in my ear. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound was unmistakable. The whispers came in short bursts, as though someone was trying to get my attention, but each time I focused on the sound, it would stop. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just tired, that I was hearing things. But the whispers were persistent. They came at odd times when I was cooking, when I was watching TV, and especially when I was lying in bed trying to sleep. The voice was always close, just out of view, as though someone was watching me from the shadows. One night, I decided to confront it. I sat in the dark, listening intently, waiting for the whispers to start. And then, just as I had hoped, it began. The faint murmur at first, then louder, closer. I was ready. I grabbed my phone and switched on the flashlight, shining it around the room. There was nothing. No one. No sign of anything out of the ordinary. But as I lowered the flashlight, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on the wall, just above the bed, were faint scratches. Not deep, but enough to catch the light. It looked like someone had dragged their fingers across the wall. I stepped closer, feeling a cold chill wash over me. And then, I heard it again. The whisper. It was coming from the corner of the room now. I turned and aimed the flashlight, but there was nothing. Only the darkness, the empty space that seemed to stretch forever. The next few days were a blur. I didn't sleep well. I barely ate. Every time I tried to rest, the whispers came back, louder, more persistent. I couldn't escape them. It felt like the voice was in my head, in my very bones, making me question my sanity. On the fourth night, as I lay in bed, the whispers returned with a vengeance. But this time, something was different. It wasn't just the voice anymore. The room felt off. The air felt colder, heavier. The whispers were no longer disembodied, they had taken shape. It was as if they were coming from something. Someone. I could feel their presence, just behind me, like a shadow that stretched across the room. I turned around, slowly, heart pounding in my chest. I aimed the flashlight at the corner of the room. There, in the darkness, I saw them figures, just barely visible, like shadowy shapes, standing in the corners, watching me. They weren't human, not entirely. They had no faces, only dark silhouettes with long, outstretched limbs. Their bodies seemed to shift and ripple like smoke. I froze, unable to move. The whispering grew louder, frantic, and then, all at once, the figures began to move toward me, their whispers growing louder and more urgent. I scrambled out of bed, the flashlight slipping from my hand as I backed into the corner of the room. The shadows seemed to follow me, surrounding me, the whispers turning into voices distinct, clear, and full of malice. I covered my ears, trying to block them out, but it didn't work. The voices were in my head now, and no matter what I did, I couldn't escape them. Suddenly, everything went silent. I opened my eyes, and the shadows were gone. The room was empty again. The whispers stopped, and the air grew still. The next morning, I packed up my things and left the cabin as quickly as I could. I didn't care about my reservation, or the money I'd paid. I just needed to get away from there. Even now, I don't know what happened that night. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired, stressed, and hallucinating. But deep down, I know what I saw, what I heard. I know the whispers were real. The shadows were real. And something was waiting in that cabin, watching, listening. I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear the whispers again. Soft, familiar voices that seem to come from nowhere, drifting into my mind. I don't know if they are memories or if they are still out there, waiting for me to return. Scared yet? Let us know how you feel in the comments. Story 6, The Phone Call from the Past. I've always been a bit of a loner, enjoying my own company and the peace that comes with solitude. I live in a small, modest apartment in a quiet part of town. Nothing fancy, but it's enough for me. It was a place where I could unwind after a long day at work and find comfort in the silence. At least, that's what I thought. It had been a tough few weeks. Work had been stressful, and I hadn't been sleeping well. I found myself tossing and turning, constantly waking up in the middle of the night. To make matters worse, my sleep had become increasingly restless, haunted by vivid dreams that felt all too real. But one night, everything changed. It was a Thursday evening, and I had just finished a late dinner. I settled on the couch, hoping for a quiet night of relaxation before heading to bed. My phone was on the coffee table, as it usually was, and I had a glass of water beside me. The apartment was eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the building's old wooden floorboards. I leaned back into the couch, ready to unwind, when suddenly, my phone rang. The screen lit up with an unfamiliar number, and the name displayed gave me an odd sense of discomfort. It was a number I didn't recognize, but it wasn't just any number, it was the number of my late mother. I froze. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the screen, the name Mom glowing eerily in front of me. I hadn't changed my mother's contact details in years, but she had passed away a few months ago, and I hadn't deleted her number. For a moment, I thought maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was a mistake, some glitch in the phone system. But the call was coming through, loud and clear, ringing like any other phone call. Confused, I picked up the phone, my hand trembling slightly. "Hello," I said, my voice shaking. The other end was silent. I could hear a faint crackling sound, like the connection was unstable, but there was no voice. No one spoke. Just the static, buzzing quietly in my ear. I waited for a few seconds, but nothing came through. I checked the phone again, expecting to see that the call had ended, but it was still active. I hung up, convinced it was some sort of weird glitch. But just as I was about to set the phone down, the screen flashed again. It was another call from the same number. This time, I didn't hesitate. I answered the phone, desperate for some sort of explanation. "Mom? Is that you?" I asked quietly. The line was still filled with static. But then, just as I was about to hang up again, I heard something, a voice, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't my mother's voice, but it was definitely someone speaking. The voice was soft, almost like a whisper, but clear enough for me to understand. "Don't hang up." My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I stared at the phone, my hand growing clammy. Who was that? What did they mean? And why did they sound so familiar? I swallowed hard, trying to calm myself down. The voice came again, this time clearer and stronger. "Please, listen to me." The voice was distant, almost as if it were coming from the other side of a great distance, but it was unmistakable. I knew it. I couldn't place it at first, but then it hit me. The voice sounded exactly like my mother, or at least, how I remembered her voice from when I was younger. But there was something off about it, a strange distortion that didn't belong. I didn't know what to do. My heart was racing, and my mind was racing even faster, trying to make sense of it all. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the screen, but it didn't stop ringing. I hung up again, feeling a mix of dread and confusion. I tried to brush it off, but the call lingered in my mind. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The phone calls kept coming, sometimes from the same number, sometimes from different ones, but always with the same voice on the other end. The voice became more distinct with each call, and the words more urgent. Each time I picked up the phone, the same whispering plea would fill my ear. Listen. I need you. I'm here. Help me. It was maddening. I couldn't tell if it was a dream, a hallucination, or something more sinister. But what made it even worse was that the voice sounded so real, so personal, that I couldn't dismiss it. It was like a part of me was hearing it, or perhaps even wanting to hear it. And then, things began to take a more unsettling turn. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I went to bed early, hoping to get some much-needed rest. I tried to clear my mind of the disturbing calls, but as soon as I closed my eyes, the phone rang again. I reached over in the dark and grabbed the phone, the screen illuminating the room. The number that flashed was the same as before, my mother's number. I answered, this time with a lump in my throat. Mom. I whispered into the phone, half expecting the voice to be there again. This time, the voice that answered wasn't the same. It was deeper, more guttural. Almost like someone was mimicking her voice, but doing it poorly, forcing it into a sound that was wrong. You shouldn't have hung up on me, the voice said, a dark edge creeping into the tone. My heart sank, and my breath caught in my throat. The voice was nothing like my mother's, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was her, or that something dark and familiar was attached to it. I heard the voice again, louder, sharper this time. Don't hang up again. You need to come back. You need to remember. I was frozen, unable to speak, as the voice continued to call out to me. It was like something was clawing at me from the other side, desperate for attention. Desperate for something from me. I couldn't explain it. I had to do something. Please, stop, I whispered back, my voice shaking. Please, stop calling me. But the voice didn't stop. Instead, the sound of heavy breathing followed, distorted and strange. And then, I heard a new sound of faint tapping, like fingernails on glass, echoing through the phone. It was frantic, erratic. And then, I heard it. The final words that would change everything. You never found my body. My blood ran cold. The words hit me like a physical blow. My mother had passed away, yes, but I never once considered that something was wrong with her death. Was it an accident? A natural cause? Or had something more sinister happened? What did this voice mean by those words? I dropped the phone in horror, staring at the screen, but the call didn't end. The static was now louder than the voice, a low hum that buzzed through the speaker like some otherworldly presence. And then, it clicked. The tapping sound continued, followed by another whisper that sent chills down my spine. Come back. Find me. I didn't know what to believe anymore. The calls continued. Day after day, night after night. It wasn't just the voice of my mother anymore. It was something else. A presence, something unseen but always there, whispering into the silence of the night. And every time I heard it, it got closer. But the calls didn't just haunt me. They followed me. I changed my number. I moved apartments. I even moved cities. But no matter where I went, no matter how far I tried to run, the calls came back. And every time they did, I could hear the tapping. The sound of nails on glass. And every time I picked up, I could hear a whisper, growing closer with each passing moment, saying the same thing. Find me. Like this story? Tap like, and tell us which part creeped you out the most. Story 7, The Whispers in the Walls. I've always been someone who values peace and quiet, the kind of person who finds comfort in the stillness of an empty house. I've lived alone for years now, and over time, I've grown accustomed to the solitude. My apartment is small, located on the top floor of an old building that has seen better days. The creaky floors, the drafty windows, the slightly crooked doors, they've all become part of my daily life. It's a place where I can escape the world and its noise. But there's something about the apartment that's always felt a little off. I never paid much attention to it, though. I assumed it was just the quirks of living in an older building, things that come with time and age. The flickering light bulbs, the groaning of the pipes, the occasional sound of something moving in the walls. These are the things I thought nothing of. That is, until one night when the whispers began. It was a Friday evening, and I had just finished a long week at work. I was exhausted, eager to get to bed early and sleep without interruptions. The apartment was dark, except for the faint glow of the street lights outside my window. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional gust of wind rattling the window panes. I turned off the lights and slipped into bed, pulling the covers up and closing my eyes. I tried to clear my mind, but it was hard. There was a lingering feeling of unease that I couldn't quite shake, like I was being watched. But I chalked it up to the stress of the week and told myself to relax. After all, nothing had ever happened before. Then, as I lay there, the first whisper came. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or perhaps the building settling. But then it came again, softer this time, almost imperceptible. Help me. I froze. The voice was so faint, so distant, that I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. I turned my head, straining to listen, but there was nothing. The silence was deafening. I convinced myself it was just the wind or some other odd noise from the building. But then, it happened again. This time, clearer. Louder. Help me. The voice was so real, so close, that it sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't coming from outside or from the street. It was coming from the walls. I sat up in bed, heart pounding in my chest. The room was still. I waited for the voice to come again, but nothing. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, steady and slow, but no whispers. I shook my head, trying to rationalize what I had heard. Maybe it was the pipes again. Or maybe the building was settling. After all, it was an old building, right? I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and went back to sleep, though I couldn't completely ignore the sensation that something wasn't right. The next few days, the whispers grew more frequent. At first, they were just faint, barely audible sounds that seemed to come from deep within the walls. But soon, they were louder, more insistent. I'd be lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I would hear them. Sometimes, it was just a word or two. Other times, it was full sentences. "Help me. Please, let me out." The voice sounded desperate, as if it was begging for something. It was always the same voice, soft and pleading. I could never place it, but it felt familiar somehow. Almost like a voice I should know, but couldn't quite remember. I began to hear the whispers at all hours of the day, not just when I was lying in bed. In the middle of the afternoon, when the sunlight was streaming through the windows, I would hear it. Sometimes it would come from the wall next to my bed, other times from the hallway, or even from the ceiling above me. It was impossible to pinpoint where it was coming from. The more I heard it, the more the words began to make sense. "I'm trapped. You have to help." I knew something wasn't right, but I didn't know what. It was driving me mad. I would get up in the middle of the night and check the walls, search for any signs of a hidden passage, but I found nothing. I even called my landlord, asking about the age of the building, but he insisted that it was just the sounds of old pipes and settling floors. But then, something happened that I couldn't ignore. One night, I was lying in bed, just about to fall asleep when the whispers started again. This time, though, the voice was different. It wasn't the same soft, pleading tone. This time, it was a low, guttural sound, like a rasping breath. And then, a word I could never forget. "Out." I bolted upright, heart racing. The voice was coming from the corner of the room, right next to my bed. The air grew cold, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I got out of bed, trembling, and moved toward the corner where the voice had come from. There was nothing there. Just the same empty space, the same silence. But I could feel something. Something heavy in the air, a presence. It was as if the room itself was watching me, waiting for me to do something. The whispers continued over the next few days, each one growing more desperate, more insistent. And then, one evening, while I was sitting in the living room, I heard a new sound. It wasn't a whisper this time, but a faint scraping noise. It sounded like something moving behind the walls, something large, something that shouldn't be there. I grabbed a flashlight and went into the hallway, following the sound. It led me to the small closet in the corner of the hallway, the one I rarely used. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear the scraping sound coming from inside. I hesitated for a moment, my heart racing, before I mustered the courage to open the door. Inside, the closet was dark and empty. But as I shone the flashlight around, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The wall in the back of the closet was cracked, the plaster chipped and broken. And behind it, there was a small, dark space just large enough for a person to crawl through. I couldn't explain it. The wall had never been like this before. It was as if something had been trying to break through from the other side. Suddenly, the whispers came again, louder now, more urgent. "I'm here. Please. Help me." Without thinking, I crawled through the hole in the wall. My heart was pounding as I squeezed through the narrow opening, the sound of the whispers growing louder and louder. On the other side, the room was cold and damp, filled with an oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. And there, in the corner, was something I'll never forget. A figure. A pale, gaunt figure, crouched in the shadows. It was barely human, with long, thin arms and a face that seemed to twist and shift in the darkness. I couldn't look away, even though every instinct in my body told me to run. It opened its mouth, and the whispers came again. But this time, I understood the words. "Help me. You have to let me out." I don't remember how I managed to escape that night. I only know that I ran, as fast as I could, back through the hole in the wall and out into the hallway. I slammed the closet door shut behind me, my heart racing in my chest. Since that night, the whispers have never stopped. They still come, every night, every time I try to sleep. They call to me from the walls, from the corners of the room. I hear them in the silence, in the dark. And every time I close my eyes, I can feel that presence, that thing, waiting. The whispers never stop. They never will. And I know, deep down, that they are calling me. Would you have stayed in that house? Let us know below. Story 8, The Unseen Visitor. It was the middle of winter, and the nights were long and cold. I had just moved into a small house on the edge of town, a place that I could afford and hopefully spend some time alone to get my thoughts together. I wasn't new to being alone. In fact, I'd spent years living on my own in apartments, but this house, it had a different feeling. The creaky floors, the dust that seemed to accumulate even in the cleanest corners, and the strange way the air felt still, even when I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, it all added to the atmosphere of isolation. Still, it was mine. I had my routines, work during the day, peaceful evenings alone at night, cooking a quiet dinner, and sitting in front of the TV. It was the kind of life I was used to. The first night I spent there, I had no issues at all. It was only after a week that things began to change. It started with noises I couldn't explain. At first, it was just the typical old house sounds: the walls groaning, the creak of floorboards settling. But soon, the noises began to evolve. It was around 2 a.m. one cold night, after I had just finished reading in bed. I was lying in the dark, about to drift off to sleep, when I heard it. A soft, shuffling sound, as if something was dragging its feet across the hallway outside my bedroom door. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat. I lay still, straining to hear it again, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling. But the sound continued. Slow. Dragging. I pushed myself up in bed, my hands shaking slightly, my breath shallow. I could feel the tension in the air, the silence that followed the strange noise. I got up, slowly moving to the door, my bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I should even open it. I hesitated for a few seconds, trying to talk myself out of it. But curiosity won, and I opened the door just a crack, peering out into the hallway. The dim light from the living room filtered through, but I could see nothing. No person, no animal, nothing that could explain the sound. I stepped out cautiously, the air in the hallway cold and stale. My heart was racing now, and I tried to steady my nerves as I glanced down the hallway. There was nothing unusual. No movement, no sign of anything out of place. I checked every room, the living room, the kitchen, and even the basement. It was all empty. I went back to bed, feeling a little silly, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the house settling. After all, old houses make noises, right? But then the noises didn't stop. Every night, around the same time, I would hear it. The dragging steps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. Sometimes, it would sound like something heavy was being pulled across the floor. Other times, the steps would echo, like someone walking barefoot, their feet brushing against the floor with each step. I would lie in bed, awake and tense, listening to the sound grow closer and closer to my bedroom door. Then it would stop. Dead silence. And then, just as suddenly, it would start again, further down the hallway, always approaching my door. I tried to dismiss it. I told myself it was the wind, or perhaps an animal in the walls. But there was no denying the rhythm of the footsteps. They were too distinct, too precise. One evening, after a particularly long and unnerving day, I decided to confront whatever was causing the noise. I gathered up every ounce of courage I had and stood by the door, listening intently. The footsteps started again, and I took a deep breath before opening the door wide. I scanned the hallway, my eyes darting from one end to the other, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. I stepped out into the hallway, the cold air biting at my skin. I moved slowly, cautiously, until I reached the staircase. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. But then, from behind me, I heard it again. A soft whisper, like someone speaking just behind me. "Hello." I whipped around, heart hammering, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. The next night, the noise returned, and this time, it wasn't just the dragging footsteps. There was something else. I heard faint breathing, like someone was standing just outside my bedroom door, waiting. I stayed in bed, my body tense, as the footsteps grew louder. The breathing became more distinct, and the presence behind the door felt suffocating. I tried to stay still, not daring to make a sound. It felt like something was just inches away from me. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled. I jumped, my heart racing in my chest. The door was locked, so it couldn't have been someone trying to open it. But the sound, the pressure on the knob, was unmistakable. It was as if someone was trying to get in. I didn't move. I couldn't. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, and I was too afraid to even breathe. I stared at the door, listening for any other sound. But after what seemed like an eternity, the rattling stopped. I didn't dare open the door. Instead, I stayed in bed, paralyzed with fear, until I fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, when I finally got the courage to leave my room, I saw something that froze me in place. There, on the floor near my door, was a single shoe. A child's shoe. The strange occurrences continued for weeks, each one more unsettling than the last. But the single shoe was the final straw. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't explain the footsteps, the whispers, or the strange, chilling presence that seemed to follow me. I eventually moved out, unable to shake the feeling that something or someone had been waiting for me in that house. But every now and then, I hear the dragging footsteps in my mind. The whispers at the edge of my thoughts. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I can hear the soft sound of a child's voice calling my name. But when I turn to look, there's nothing there. I wonder, sometimes, if that house still waits for someone else to hear the footsteps, and if they'll be brave enough to open the door. If you're still listening with the lights off, you're braver than most. Comment still here. Story 9, The Door in the Wall. I had always been an independent person, so when I moved into my new apartment, I was eager to start fresh. The place was cozy, located on the top floor of an old building that had seen better days. I had heard some strange things about the building, rumors about strange noises late at night and the odd behavior of former tenants. But I wasn't one to believe in superstitions. Besides, the apartment was affordable, and I was looking forward to settling into my own space. The first few nights went by without incident. But on the fourth night, something happened that I couldn't easily explain. It was late, and I was drifting off to sleep when I heard it. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a soft, rhythmic tapping from somewhere within the walls of the apartment. I shrugged it off, assuming it was the pipes or some old pipes creaking as the building shifted. But as the night went on, the tapping grew louder and more frequent. It was a rhythmic sound, almost like someone was knocking on the walls, but there was no pattern to it. Sometimes it would sound like a soft, slow scratch, while other times it would be sharp, like fingernails tapping quickly against the drywall. I got out of bed and checked the apartment, trying to locate the source of the sound. There were no pipes running along that wall, no open vents, just the solid structure of the building. I lay sworn I heard my name. The next night, the whispers changed. They were no longer hushed tones. Now they were full-fledged screams of pain, anguish, and terror. The sounds were so vivid that I thought I could almost feel the vibrations in the walls. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight, determined to find the source of these strange noises once and for all. I moved across the apartment, searching every inch of the walls, every corner, every crack. When I turned the corner into the hallway, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks, a faint outline of a door on the wall, one that I had never noticed before. The walls were solid, and there had never been a door there before. But now, there it was, just an outline of an old wooden door, as if it had always been there, hidden. I reached out, trembling, and pushed against the door. To my shock, it creaked open. The room inside was pitch black, but I could hear breathing, slow, labored, like something was waiting just beyond my vision. And then, in the darkness, I heard a voice. "Help me!" The door slammed shut, and the sound stopped immediately. I never figured out what caused the noises in the walls that night, nor did I ever dare open that door again. I moved out of that apartment a week later, but I still sometimes hear the whispers at night, echoing in the back of my mind. As for the room, it still haunts me. I'm not sure what I heard behind that door, but I'm certain it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. What would you have done differently? Let us know down there. Story 10, The Sound of Someone Watching. I always liked the idea of living in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. So, when I found a small house for rent on a secluded street, I jumped at the opportunity. The place was tucked away behind tall trees, and there was hardly any noise at night. It seemed like the perfect escape from the chaos of the city. For the first few days, everything seemed fine. But on the fourth night, after a long day at work, I decided to get an early night's sleep. I locked all the windows, pulled the blinds, and settled into bed. It was around midnight when I first heard the noise. A faint rustling sound, as though someone was brushing against the window. I sat up, instantly alert. My first thought was that it was the wind, or maybe an animal outside. But then, I heard something even more unnerving, a soft, slow breathing sound, like someone was standing just outside my window, breathing in the cold night air. I felt a chill run through me. The windows were locked, the blinds were drawn, so I couldn't understand why I was hearing this. It was too distinct to be the wind. And too deliberate. I got out of bed, cautiously approaching the window, trying to peer through the blinds. But I saw nothing. The following night, the breathing returned. But this time, it was accompanied by a light scratching sound against the window, like nails running along the glass. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding in my chest, and turned on the lights. But the moment I did, the scratching stopped. I checked the window, the yard, the bushes outside, but there was nothing. No footprints. No signs of anyone being there. Over the next few nights, the sounds grew more persistent. The scratching became louder, and the breathing grew heavier. It felt as if someone was just outside, waiting for me to acknowledge them. One night, I couldn't take it any longer. I decided to stay awake and catch whoever or whatever it was. I kept the lights off, lying in bed with my eyes wide open, listening to every small sound. The night was eerily quiet, almost too quiet. Then, it came again, the breathing, soft and labored. But this time, it was accompanied by a soft tapping on the window. I couldn't hold back any longer. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and went to the window. I slowly pulled back the blinds, my heart racing in my chest. What I saw made my blood run cold. Standing just outside the window, staring directly at me, was a figure. A man, or something that looked like a man, his face pale and expressionless. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, and he didn't move. I screamed, but the figure didn't flinch. He just stood there, unmoving. Then, without warning, he vanished into thin air. I moved out of that house the next day, but I still hear the scratching sometimes. and when I look out the window, I sometimes see a shadow lurking just beyond the glass. I wonder if I'll ever truly escape the sound of someone watching me. If you're reading this, you survived, but would you sleep alone again tonight? Comment yes or never. If you made it through the night with us, you're braver than most. But before you go, tell us, have you ever heard something strange while sleeping alone? Leave your story in the comments. And if these tales chilled your spine, remember to like this video, subscribe for more, and join us again, in the shadows.